They called it the Golden House, Rome's grandest palace, built by Emperor Nero to mirror the heavens. But beneath its marble floors and perfumed halls lay a truth too dark for history to record. Behind every song, every feast, and every echo of laughter hid the cries of women silenced by imperial command. Tonight we descend into those forbidden chambers where power demanded blood, and the womb itself became a weapon of the emperor's pride. Rome's imperial palace glittered under torchlight, a monument to control disguised as glory. Gold leaf shimmered across ceilings painted with gods, yet within those walls, mortal women lived under divine decrees. To be chosen by the emperor was both an honor and a sentence. Inside this world of power and illusion, the body of a woman belonged not to herself, but to the crown. It began with whispers, always the same: "The emperor does not permit heirs without his name." Those words carried the weight of death. Nero, young yet already drunk on absolute power, saw motherhood not as sacred, but as subversive. No woman, he believed, should bear life that might rival his blood. In the endless corridors of the Domus Aurea, the scent of roses masked the quiet weeping of servants and slaves. The emperor's decree had turned nature itself into treason. Pregnancies were discovered, not celebrated. Physicians came, cloaked in silence, to inspect the bodies of those favored by Nero or his courtiers. What followed those visits was known only by the muffled cries behind closed doors. The palace was a living entity, a creature of marble and fear. Its heart beat in hidden chambers where women were brought under pretense of ritual purification. The priests said the rites honored Venus. The truth was that Venus had long since fled. The women who entered those rooms rarely emerged unchanged. Some returned pale and fragile, their eyes hollowed by pain. Others vanished entirely, their names erased from the ledgers of the palace like unwanted verses in an imperial song. Outside the palace, Rome thrived. Senators debated, poets sang, the Colosseum's construction loomed on the horizon. Yet none spoke of what happened in the emperor's home. To question his will was to invite ruin. Even the Empress Poppaea knew that her beauty and influence existed only as long as Nero's affection endured. In the center of this empire of silence, the womb became a battlefield. Women of noble birth and low rank alike shared the same fate. There were no mothers in Nero's court, only vessels emptied for the sake of order. At night, the palace whispered. Servants spoke of dreams filled with crying infants, of shadows that moved without form. Some said the walls absorbed sorrow like a sponge, that the marble itself remembered every scream. Yet in daylight, all was spectacle, music, perfumes, and the endless play of power. For the emperor, the palace was perfection. No child cried, no heir threatened, no rumor of scandal could survive the controlled beauty of his domain. But beneath the painted ceilings, beneath the silken veils and censers of incense, a sickness grew. The silenced wombs of the palace held more than lost life. They held the beginning of the emperor's shame. And so the stage was set for betrayal, for cruelty disguised as ritual, for the sins that would one day destroy even the empire's golden walls. Within the heart of Rome, the palace stood radiant, eternal. But to those who lived inside it, every glimmer of gold was a mirror reflecting their own despair. It was here, among the perfumed corridors and silent tears, that a single story would emerge, the story of a young woman named Claudia Livia. Once devoted to purity and faith, soon condemned by the very gods she once served. Her secret would become the whisper that haunted emperors for generations to come. Because within Nero's palace, the womb was not sacred. It was forbidden. Her name was Claudia Livia, once a priestess of Vesta, sworn to chastity and fire. The goddess's flame had burned in her hands since childhood, steady and pure. But purity was fragile in Rome, and in Nero's palace, even fire could be bought. Claudia had been chosen, or rather taken, from the temple of Vesta under the emperor's decree. The excuse was ceremonial, a blessing upon the household, but everyone knew what it meant. When Nero's eyes lingered, his will followed. No law, no god, no vow could stand before imperial desire. In the beginning, Nero treated her like a vision. He spoke of poetry and the heavens, of gods reborn through mortal union. He compared her to Diana, untouchable yet desired. But as the weeks passed, the devotion turned to ownership. The emperor's fascination soured into control. He summoned her at night, dismissed her at dawn. Every look was a command, every silence an order. The palace murmured. The courtiers pretended not to know. To be Nero's secret consort was to live between privilege and peril. The Empress Poppaea smiled through painted lips, her eyes veiled but her mind sharp. Nothing escaped her notice. In the empire's most dangerous home, jealousy was a weapon, and Poppaea wielded it well. Then came the forbidden sting. Claudia felt it first as sickness, then as a quiet tremor beneath her heart. A life impossibly small, forming within her. For the first time, she feared not the emperor, but herself. A priestess of purity carrying the emperor's child. It was both miracle and doom. When the midwives confirmed her condition, their faces went pale. One of them, an older woman called Nyssa, whispered tremblingly, "Do not tell anyone. Pray to Venus for mercy." But mercy did not live in Nero's palace. That night, Claudia was summoned to the emperor's chamber. Nero reclined among silks, strumming his lyre, his expression unreadable. When she fell to her knees, trembling, he asked softly, "Do you love me, Claudia?" "Yes, my lord," she whispered, though her voice cracked. "Then you will obey me," he said. "This," he gestured toward her stomach with faint disgust, "cannot live. Rome needs no bastard heir. The people would whisper, the Senate would mock me. You understand?" She did not speak. She only lowered her head. The emperor's fingers brushed her cheek, gentle as a serpent's tongue. "Do not weep. It will be done quietly. You will be purified, like the sacred fire you once served." That night, Claudia prayed in her chamber until her knees bled. The gods she once trusted gave no answer. The sacred flame in the temple of Vesta burned far away, untouchable. Inside the palace, the only fire was that of lamps burning oil, and the heart of a girl learning what divine silence truly meant. Days passed in dread. The midwives known as silent hands began to appear more frequently near her quarters. They spoke softly, never meeting her gaze. Silver bowls, vials of dark oil, folded linens, these things began to appear like omens of death. Claudia dreamt of escape. Once, she tried to flee through the servant corridors, but guards found her within moments. The emperor had already anticipated rebellion. For every locked door, there was a watcher. For every whisper, an ear. Meanwhile, Poppaea watched her downfall unfold with the calm cruelty of one who has suffered the same. In the empress's chambers, rumor said she too had once carried Nero's child, only to be ordered cleansed. But where Claudia wept, Poppaea smiled. "The emperor's favor," she said to her attendants, "is a blessing that burns." One evening, Claudia was brought before a priest of Venus under pretense of atonement. The priest's eyes were empty, his hands shaking. Behind him, Nyssa and two midwives waited with bronze tools hidden in their linen wraps. Claudia understood then, this was not a confession. It was an execution dressed as faith. She looked once toward the statue of Venus, its marble smile cold and eternal. "If you are goddess of love," Claudia whispered, "then witness what love has become." Outside, Rome glowed under sunset, red as spilled blood. Inside, the emperor played music to drown the silence he had created. And in a corner of the palace where torches flickered low, a woman's breath quickened into prayer, then scream, then nothing. By dawn, the hall smelled faintly of myrrh and smoke. Nero rose refreshed, declaring the day auspicious. Poppaea wore pearls and perfume. Life in the palace continued, beautiful and monstrous. But in the servants' quarters, one whisper began to spread. The emperor's consort had been purified by fire and blood. And though her chamber was cleansed, a single streak of crimson remained on the marble floor. None dared wash it away, because in Nero's palace, even silence could speak. They were called the Silent Hands, women who served the palace not in glory, but in secrecy. Their names never appeared in ledgers, their faces forgotten by history. Yet within Nero's palace, their touch decided who would live and who would be erased. By daylight, they moved like ghosts among the corridors, carrying herbs, towels, and jars of oil. At night, they became the emperor's invisible executioners. Their purpose was not to bring life, but to end it quietly, leaving behind no trace that could shame the empire's image of perfection. The leader of the Silent Hands was Nysa, a midwife of long service whose eyes had seen too much. Once, she had been healer to senators' wives and noblewomen. Now she was prisoner to imperial duty. Her craft had become a weapon. With herbs that could still the womb and oils that numbed the senses, she delivered death beneath the guise of mercy. The chamber where they worked lay deep within the palace's lower halls, a place known among servants as the Room of the Moon. No windows pierced its walls. Only oil lamps flickered against stone, casting shadows that seemed to breathe. The air was heavy with incense to mask the scent of iron and fear. Every instrument gleamed with unnatural purity. Bronze hooks, polished knives, thin glass phials filled with dark liquid. The women who entered that room never entered willingly. Some were slaves who had caught their master's attention. Others, noble consorts like Claudia, whose pregnancies risked imperial disgrace. Each was told it was a ritual, a purification, an act for the gods. But the gods had long abandoned this place. Nysa had learned to keep her voice steady, her hands sure. She no longer asked names made the work unbearable. Each procedure was done in whispers, under oaths of secrecy enforced by fear. For every woman saved from suspicion, another was lost to silence. One night, after Claudia's ritual had been completed, Nysa lingered by the basin. Blood swirled in the water like fading ink. A younger midwife asked, almost trembling, "Do you ever pray for them?" Nysa's lips tightened. Prayer is for those who can be forgiven. Still, she prayed, not to the gods above, but to the spirits below, that they might remember what history would not. Outside the chamber, the palace celebrated a victory. Nero had decreed a festival to honor household purity. Musicians played in marble courtyards, while the Silent Hands worked in darkness, their task an inversion of the empire's pageantry. The emperor believed order could be preserved through control, that even the body could serve the empire's perfection. The midwives were the tools of that illusion. Each abortion they performed was another stone in the wall of silence Nero built around his shame. But whispers began to rise among servants. They spoke of women who went missing, of strange smells beneath the baths, of infants' cries heard at midnight, though no child lived in the palace. The Silent Hands dismissed these as superstition, yet even they felt the weight of something unholy pressing on their souls. For Nysa, every act left a mark. She began leaving tiny offerings after each ritual, sprigs of rosemary for remembrance, a drop of oil for peace. She hid them in the cracks of marble walls where no one would notice. It was all she could do to atone. And still, the work continued. Each dawn brought another order, another name whispered by the palace steward. The Silent Hands obeyed. They always obeyed. But among them, one heart began to tremble, Nysa's apprentice, a girl named Aelia, who could not forget the eyes of Claudia Livia, open and pleading even as life drained away. That night, Aelia whispered to herself, "The gods see." She did not know that her small act of conscience would one day shatter the emperor's illusion. and turned the palace of perfection into a house of blood. The chamber was prepared long before Claudia was brought there. Perfume burned in bronze bowls, thick coils of incense crawling upward like living mist. To anyone passing by, it would have appeared as a ritual of worship, a ceremony to honor the goddess Venus. But to those within, it was the quiet theater of cruelty, staged to mask a crime sanctioned by power. Claudia was led inside by two attendants dressed in white, their faces veiled. Her steps were unsteady. Her breath trembled as the heavy air pressed against her skin. She could hear music faintly from above, Nero's musicians rehearsing for a banquet, the sound of laughter cutting through her terror. The contrast made her dizzy. At the chamber's center stood a stone altar covered in silk and laurel leaves. Beside it, Nyssa, the chief of the Silent Hands, arranged her tools with meticulous calm. The younger midwife, Aelia, looked pale, her hands trembling as she poured oil into a shallow dish. Every movement was practiced, reverent, and deliberate. Even cruelty had ritual here. When the incense reached its thickest point, the priest of Venus entered, carrying a small statue of the goddess. He set it upon the altar, its carved eyes catching the dim light. "Venus purifies," he murmured. "Venus forgives." Claudia's lips parted, her voice barely a whisper. "Then may she forgive you all." Her words earned her a glance from Nyssa, not of anger, but pity. Still, the work began. The air turned dense and surreal. Myrrh, sandalwood, and blood mingled into one scent, sacred and sickening. Claudia's cries broke through the chanting, muffled by the cloth pressed to her mouth. The priest continued reciting verses as though the agony before him were prayer. The Silent Hands moved quickly, their eyes averted, their faces blank. It was not the first time, and it would not be the last. When the pain became unbearable, Claudia's voice faltered into silence. Only the rhythm of Nyssa's breathing filled the chamber. At last, the sound of metal against stone marked the end. The priest extinguished the incense. The smoke twisted upward one final time, forming shapes that looked almost human before fading into darkness. "It is done," he said, his tone flat, almost relieved. Aelia stepped back, trembling. Her apron was stained, her eyes wet. "She's so still," she whispered. Nyssa placed a hand on the girl's shoulder. "She is beyond pain now." They cleaned the altar, wrapped the body in linen, and sprinkled rose petals to hide the smell. Above them, the emperor's laughter echoed faintly from the distant halls. When Nero's steward entered to inspect the room, he smiled coldly. "The emperor thanks you. Rome remains pure." He dropped a small pouch of coins on the table before leaving. No one spoke. The sound of the door closing was the only sign the ritual had ever happened. As dawn broke, thin rays of sunlight filtered through the cracks in the marble ceiling. Smoke lingered, curling lazily around the statue of Venus. Her face, carved in eternal serenity, seemed to watch over the scene, a goddess who had witnessed too much. Nyssa lingered a moment longer. She touched the altar with 2 fingers and whispered, "Forgive us." Then she motioned to Aelia to gather the tools and follow her out. By the time the palace awoke, the chamber stood empty. Only the faint scent of incense and a dark stain beneath the altar remained, impossible to scrub away, even by the most loyal servants. And in the still air of that perfumed tomb, it seemed for a moment that the smoke itself breathed, carrying with it the ghost of a girl who had once believed that love was sacred. The morning after the ritual, Poppaea Sabina, Empress of Rome, stood upon her marble balcony overlooking the gardens of the Domus Aurea. Dew clung to the rose petals below, glistening like jewels in the rising sun. The palace shimmered with peace, a peace that had been purchased in blood only hours before. She smiled. It was the kind of smile that did not reach the eyes. Below, slaves swept the courtyard, scrubbing at faint crimson stains near a side passage, traces of Claudia Livia's final walk. Poppaea watched silently, her robe of pale silk catching the light. Her beauty was legendary in Rome, her composure unbreakable. Yet beneath that flawless surface was something colder: memory. Years earlier, before her coronation, Poppaea had endured the same fate. Nero had loved her once with obsession. Then fear had poisoned that love. When her womb had quickened, he'd whispered of omens, of purity, of divine will. The silent hands had come for her, too. She had survived, barely, but the child had not. Since then, her beauty had been her armor, and cruelty, her survival. Now, watching the palace stir beneath her, she felt no horror, no pity. Only a quiet satisfaction. Every act of pain within these walls deepened her control. The emperor, in his vanity, believed himself absolute. But it was Poppaea who whispered in his ear when he slept. Poppaea who decided which woman would please him next, and which would vanish by morning. Her maid, a timid girl named Selene, approached with trembling hands. "Majesty," she murmured, "the priests say the ritual was successful. The emperor is pleased." "Of course he is," Poppaea replied softly without turning. Men mistake silence for peace. From the distance came the faint strains of Nero's lyre, played in his private chambers. He often sang after his cruelties, as though art could wash away the stain of what he had done. Poppaea had learned to endure the sound, even to enjoy it, each note a reminder that even the gods demanded blood before granting pleasure. She descended from her balcony and entered the Hall of Mirrors, where the Empress's attendants waited with oils and jewels. As they dressed her, she caught her reflection, the perfect image of imperial grace. Yet in the corner of her gaze, she thought she saw something move. A shadow, a flicker of pale silk, a face she knew. Claudia's face. For a heartbeat, the Empress froze. Then she blinked, and the illusion was gone. "Bring me my veil," she said calmly. When Nero entered a short while later, radiant in gold and white, he found his wife serene, her eyes cool and adoring. He kissed her hand, oblivious to the ice beneath her touch. "My Empress," he said proudly, "Venus herself has blessed us again. The palace is clean." "Yes," she replied. So clean one could almost forget the filth beneath. He laughed, mistaking her venom for wit, and spoke of a grand feast to celebrate household harmony. Poppaea nodded, already planning every detail, the dancers, the songs, the costumes. Her mind never rested. Each spectacle she arranged was another layer of perfume to hide the palace's stench. When Nero left, she turned once more to the mirror. "Harmony," she whispered. "Yes. Let them dance for it." Outside, the roses bloomed blood red beneath the sun. The palace gleamed with marble perfection. But the Empress knew its truth. Every corridor, every garden path was watered by the tears of the silenced. And as the scent of incense drifted through the air, Poppaea Sabina smiled again, a smile both radiant and ruined. The smile of a woman who had learned that power, in Rome, was not given by the gods. It was taken in blood. That night, the palace blazed with light. Torches lined every column, silver lamps burned fragrant oil, and the ceilings glowed with painted constellations. Nero had declared a celebration of domestic harmony, a feast to honor the peace of his imperial household. But those who served in the palace knew the truth. Whenever Nero sought to display peace, it was because blood had already been spilled. The guests arrived glittering like gods, senators, poets, generals, and courtiers draped in silk and gold. The air shimmered with perfume and lies. Beneath the laughter, whispers moved like smoke. Where is the emperor's new consort? Why has her name been erased from the songs? No one dared speak too loudly. In Nero's palace, curiosity was treason. At the far end of the banquet hall, the emperor sat enthroned beneath a canopy of peacock feathers, his face radiant with wine and satisfaction. Poppaea Sabina reclined beside him, her eyes half-lidded, her smile poised and poisonous. The musicians played softly, their flutes weaving notes of unnatural sweetness through the air. Then came the entertainment. Nero loved spectacle, and tonight he surpassed himself. A group of dancers entered, their faces covered by masks shaped like mothers and infants. Their garments were dyed crimson, their movements stylized and grotesque. The crowd laughed at first, not understanding. The dance began as a parody of birth. The women groaned theatrically, the men pretended to cut invisible chords. Then the music twisted, the rhythm sharpening. One by one, the dancers fell to the floor, their masks slipping, their bodies still. The laughter died. A strange silence followed. Poppaea's gaze flicked briefly toward her husband. Nero clapped his hands, smiling as though nothing were amiss. "Art," he declared, "must mirror life, even its most tragic truths." Some guests forced uneasy laughter. Others drank quickly, staring into their cups. The Empress's smile did not fade. At the servants' end of the hall, Elia, the youngest of the Silent Hands, stood trembling with a tray of wine. She watched the dancers collapse in mock agony and felt her stomach twist. Only days before, she had heard Claudia's real cries echo in the perfumed chamber. The parody before her felt like blasphemy. She whispered to herself, "The gods will not forgive this." The music swelled again. Nero rose to perform, his voice ringing clear. His song a hymn to Venus and the purity of Rome. As he sang, Poppaea's mind drifted elsewhere, to the balcony, to Claudia's pale face, to her own loss buried under layers of power and jewels. Every note reminded her that their palace was not built on love but on fear, and that fear, sooner or later, devoured its master. When the song ended, applause roared through the hall. Nero basked in it, eyes shining with intoxicated pride. He ordered more wine, more music, more laughter. Masks were passed among the guests, golden visages of gods and monsters. The emperor placed one over his own face, hiding his features beneath the smiling image of Apollo. Poppaea accepted hers without a word. Beneath the golden mask, her lips curved faintly. How fitting, she thought. We are all pretending to be divine while drowning in sin. As the night deepened, the feasting grew wild. Guests danced drunkenly among the pillars. Poets recited verses that no one heard. Yet through it all, an undercurrent of unease lingered. Some claimed to smell incense that wasn't there, to see smoke rising from the marble floor. Others swore they heard soft weeping beneath the music. When the last torch dimmed and the revelers stumbled away, the great hall lay littered with cups, petals, and masks. One mask, the face of a weeping woman, rested near Nero's throne, cracked clean in half. By dawn, servants would sweep it away. But that night, for those who remained awake, the palace itself seemed to sigh, as though the marble remembered what it had witnessed. And above it all, the emperor's laughter echoed through the corridors, bright and hollow, chasing ghosts that would not leave. In the vast silence of the imperial palace, where laughter echoed by day and whispers ruled by night, one man dared to listen. His name was Callistus, a servant of no importance, a shadow in Nero's household, known only for his silence. Yet silence in Rome could be the deadliest weapon of all. Callistus had served in the women's quarters long enough to know the palace's hidden rhythm, the perfume that masked fear, the curtains that hid more than they revealed, the cries that rose only when the moon was high. He had seen Claudia once, her face pale and her eyes hollow, before she vanished like smoke. The others spoke of her as if she had never existed, but Callistus knew better. The palace had swallowed her. One night, as he cleaned the marble floor of a disused chamber, his brush met something hard beneath the tiles, a small gold pendant, shaped like a crescent moon. He lifted it gently, recognizing the mark of Venus Genetrix, the goddess invoked during childbirth. Yet around the charm's edges were stains that time had failed to erase. Blood. he hid it in his robe. It was nothing a trinket, perhaps, but to him it felt alive. He had heard the midwives' muttered prayers in the corridors, their offerings of herbs left beneath the altars, their tears hidden beneath veils. He began to understand. Claudia was not the only one. There had been others. Slaves, concubines, noble daughters sent to rest within the palace walls. They were taken in secrecy, treated with incense and chants, their cries masked by music. The empire that worshipped fertility and motherhood had turned its sanctuaries into slaughterhouses. Callistus began to collect what little he could, names whispered by servants, scraps of cloth burned too quickly, herbs thrown away half-used. His trembling hands gathered these fragments like relics of faith. Each discovery deepened his horror, but also his resolve. He sought out Livia, an older servant who had once been midwife to the Empress Poppaea herself. She spoke with trembling lips. "They call it the mercy of Venus." "A lie, Callistus. It is the mercy of power. The wombs of women have become Nero's instruments." Her confession was a death sentence. She made him swear never to repeat her name, but she pressed something into his hand, a small vial of scented oil. "For the dead," she whispered. "If you find where they rest." Callistus did not sleep that night. The relic, the vial, the whispered names, all burned in his mind like a torch. The palace, once radiant with gold, seemed to him now a tomb. Even the statues of gods looked down as if ashamed. By dawn, rumors began to move through the servants' halls. Someone had been asking questions. Someone had stolen from the emperor's chamber. Callistus felt eyes upon him, watchful, cold. Yet his fear could not silence him now. He placed Claudia's pendant upon the altar of the household gods, surrounded by the faint scent of roses and smoke. "Let truth live," he murmured. But truth, in Nero's Rome, was the most dangerous offering of all. When night fell again, the palace guards found a scrap of cloth in his quarters, marked with the seal of the empress. Within hours, torches lit the corridors. Callistus was seized, dragged toward the emperor's private bathhouse, where truth would soon meet its punishment. And as he was led away, the relic of Claudia trembled beneath the flickering light, its goddess weeping silently through gold. The emperor's bathhouse was built for pleasure, not pain. White marble gleamed beneath the light of bronze lamps, perfumed steam curling through the air. Yet that night, the scent was wrong, heavier, metallic. Beneath the painted ceiling of gods and lovers, a man's screams rose and broke like waves against stone. Callistus had become the palace's newest spectacle. His hands, once steady with servitude, were bound in chains wet with condensation. Around him stood Nero's chosen guards, silent, impassive, their eyes hollow with obedience. In Rome's heart, cruelty had become a form of theater. The emperor did not attend. He rarely did. His orders were enough. "The slave who steals truth," he had said, "steals from the gods." Steam thickened. Callistus was forced into the shallow pool, the water shimmering crimson where his blood touched it. Each question echoed, "Who told you? Who gave you the relic?" But Callistus, though trembling, refused to speak. In that silence, he found the only power left to him. Outside the bathhouse, life went on as if nothing stirred. In hidden corners of the palace, midwives lit candles and whispered prayers to forgotten deities. They knew what had happened. They had known from the beginning. Claudia was not the first. Her death, and the deaths of dozens like her, stained the empire's marble deeper than wine ever could. One of those midwives, Livia, walked through the corridors at dawn carrying a small clay dish. Within it lay petals, ashes, and the faint trace of myrrh. She placed it behind a column near the women's baths, her silent offering to the unborn. No one spoke of these rituals, yet they bloomed like ghosts through every hall, hidden under layers of fear and incense. As Callistus' screams faded into the night, the palace itself seemed to shudder. The marble floor, once polished to perfection, bore streaks of rust-colored stains that no servant could wash away. Days later, when the bathhouse reopened, courtiers stepped carefully over those marks, pretending not to see. Rome had perfected the art of forgetting. But the walls remembered. In the corridors of the Domus Aurea, whispers began to spread, soft, quick, dangerous. The slaves spoke of relics. He saw the dead. He touched the forbidden altar. Some said his ghost still lingered near the baths, dripping water and blood, eyes open but unseeing. The Empress Poppaea heard of it too. From her chambers, she could smell the faint tang of iron carried by the steam. "Even marble bleeds," she said softly to her maid, watching smoke rise from her lamp. Her words were not sympathy, they were warning. Yet guilt seeped into the palace like moisture, finding every crack. Servants stumbled in their prayers, guards drank more heavily, musicians played with trembling hands. The empire's heart still beat, but its rhythm had changed, slower, darker, sickened. Late one evening, a young slave cleaning the baths found something lodged between the tiles, a fragment of gold shaped like a crescent. He did not know what it was. He only felt that it should not be there. He dropped it into the pool, and for a moment, the water shimmered red, then black. The next morning, the emperor bathed in that same pool, his reflection broken by ripples. "The palace must be cleansed," he said. And so began a new wave of silence. Servants dismissed, midwives exiled, chambers sealed. But no order could purify marble once it had tasted blood. From then on, every dawn in Nero's palace carried the same echo, the faint sound of dripping water, as if the stones themselves still wept for what had been done. The summer heat clung to Rome like a fever. The palace gardens glowed with roses and rot, the scent of both mingling in the air. Inside, Empress Poppaea Sabina reclined upon silk cushions, her hand resting over the curve of her stomach, flat now, though it had not always been. She remembered another summer, years before, when she had carried Nero's child. She remembered the herbal wine, the incense, the pain. The silent hands had worked on her too, whispering prayers to Venus while ending a life that had barely begun. Since then, her beauty had been her shield and her curse. Now, the palace was whispering again. Claudia's disappearance, the slaves' torture, the midwives' exile, all these things floated through the air like ash. Poppaea knew the pattern. When Nero grew restless, someone would bleed. And tonight, she felt the weight of his eyes even before he entered the chamber. He came without warning, his robe unfastened, his expression shifting between affection and rage. The emperor had drunk too much Falernian wine, and the gleam in his eyes was the same one he wore before ordering executions. "You look pale, my love," Poppaea said softly. Her voice was a weapon polished by years of survival. Nero smiled, a small, cruel smile. "The palace reeks of death," he said. "They say even my walls whisper." "They whisper your name," she replied, her tone almost mocking. That was the wrong answer. He struck her once. The sound echoed against marble, sharp as steel. Servants outside froze, but did not enter. They knew better. The empress fell back, her head striking the edge of a low table. For a heartbeat, silence ruled the room, then the sound of shattering glass. Nero stood over her, breathing heavily. "You mock me," he hissed. "You and your ghosts." Her blood pooled against the ivory floor, seeping toward the edge of a mosaic depicting the goddess Venus. Poppaea tried to speak, her lips forming his name, but no sound came. The goddess who had once blessed her beauty now watched in silence. Outside, thunder rolled across the city, or perhaps it was the noise of distant riots. Rome was restless, always mirroring its master's madness. By dawn, the empress was dead. The official account would say she died in childbirth, the perfect Roman tragedy. Poets would write of her grace, her devotion, her piety. Statues would be raised in her memory, their faces carved in perfect calm. Yet those who served in the palace knew the truth. There had been no child, no mercy, only rage. Nero mourned her publicly, dressed in black, tears glittering in his eyes like jewels. He ordered incense burned in every corridor, as if to drive away the stench of guilt. But the smoke only thickened, curling around him like accusation. In private, he cursed her name. "She wanted to control me," he muttered to his reflection. "She wanted to rule through my blood." That night, he walked through the silent chambers alone. The walls glowed faintly in lamplight, their frescoes alive with figures of gods, women, and beasts. Every painted face seemed to turn toward him. He reached the bathhouse and stared into the pool, the same water that had once run red with Callistus blood. In the reflection, he thought he saw Poppaea standing behind him, her lips parted, her hand outstretched. He turned, but there was only steam. From that night onward, Nero refused to be touched. He ordered every woman in the palace kept at distance, their eyes lowered, their voices silenced. He claimed the gods had cursed the wombs of Rome, that no pure heir would ever be born again. The emperor's grief became decree. His guilt became law. And the palace, once filled with music, fell into quiet mourning, not for love lost, but for the birth of something darker, a reign ruled by ghosts. The palace gardens were Rome's illusion of peace, an empire of roses built over rot. Perfumed breezes drifted from marble fountains, and peacocks wandered among trimmed hedges. Yet beneath the soil, where the roots knotted thick and dark, a secret chamber waited, one the emperor would never walk above without unknowingly standing over his sins. It began with the midwives. Those who had survived the purges after Callistus' death now worked in silence, their hands trembling as they performed their duties. They were forbidden to speak of the women they had served or the lives they had taken. But guilt has its own rituals. Each night, when the palace quieted and Nero's songs faded from the upper halls, they gathered by the garden's farthest fountain, the one shaped like a nymph pouring water from a broken urn. There, beneath the cover of vines, a narrow passage led into the earth. They brought with them small objects, a torn ribbon, a gold clasp, a lock of hair, relics of those who had been forced to suffer in silence. They buried them carefully, marking each with a handful of salt and ash. The soil was heavy, damp with the tears of the living. They called it the Chamber of Rest, though rest was the one thing denied to all within. One night Livia, the eldest of the Silent Hands, carried a small silver pin, the last thing taken from Claudia Livia's chamber. The metal had darkened with time, but she still saw her reflection faintly within it. "You will not be forgotten," she whispered as she pressed it into the earth. Her hands shook as she covered it, the scent of myrrh clinging to her fingers. Above them, the emperor slept fitfully. Nero had begun to dream of children, faceless, voiceless, reaching from shadows. He awoke with his heart pounding, convinced he heard whispers through the walls. "It's the wind," Poppaea's maid had once told him. But Poppaea was gone, and the whispers remained. He grew suspicious of the gardens. "They hide too much life," he muttered to Tigellinus, his praetorian prefect. "Cut back the roses. Burn the vines. I want nothing that roots itself beneath my house." The prefect obeyed, but even as the gardens were stripped bare, the earth below remained untouched. The midwives worked faster, desperate to finish before discovery. By torchlight, their faces glowed like fading saints, shadows of blood and devotion flickering across the walls. One evening, the emperor decided to walk the gardens himself. The moon hung low, silvering the fountains and the freshly turned soil. He felt something beneath his feet, a subtle hollowness, as though the ground itself was breathing. "What lies here?" he demanded. The gardeners bowed deeply. "A drainage chamber, Caesar." He stared at them, his gaze sharp. "Drain it then." But when the slaves pried open the stones, only a faint perfume escaped, the scent of burned herbs and old oil. Nero frowned, then turned away. Seal it again. The gods can keep their secrets. That night, thunder rolled over Rome. Rain poured into the garden, seeping through cracks in the earth, washing over the buried relics below. The midwives, watching from the colonnade, felt the soil tremble as if exhaling. In the morning, the garden looked untouched. The fountain still flowed, the marble gleamed. But beneath the surface, where the emperor's eyes could not reach, the chamber held its quiet congregation of sorrow. And from that day on, no flowers grew over that patch of soil again. Night had become a stranger to the palace. Even the torches seemed to burn with unease, their flames bowing low, as though the air itself recoiled. The servants whispered that the palace no longer slept, that the marble walls had begun to breathe. It began with sounds. A soft tapping, faint as fingers against glass, echoing through the corridors after midnight. Guards swore they heard crying behind locked doors, though every chamber stood empty. The women of the palace crossed themselves before mirrors, claiming that the reflections moved even when they stood still. The midwives, the remaining silent hands, knew what haunted them. Beneath the gardens, the relics of the unborn lay restless. They had tried to give peace to what the emperor had destroyed, but Rome's sins did not rest easily. Each death demanded remembrance, and remembrance was forbidden. Livia, the eldest of them, now walked the halls with hollow eyes. Once she had been healer to the royal women. Now her presence inspired terror. Servants avoided her shadow, saying she carried the scent of blood wherever she went. But Livia was not afraid. She alone still visited the hidden chamber below the garden, whispering the names of those long silenced, names that only she remembered. Nero's mind unraveled further with each passing night. Sleep came rarely, and when it did, it brought visions, women in white standing at the edge of his bed, their bellies bruised, their mouths open in soundless screams. He would wake thrashing, shouting for lamps, for wine, for silence. "Burn incense," he commanded one night. "Drown the air in it. I will not hear them." The palace filled with smoke, thick with cedar and frankincense. Yet the smell that lingered beneath was iron, sharp, and inescapable. Tigellinus, the emperor's prefect, suggested exorcism. "The gods are angry, Caesar. Perhaps an offering. Enough." Nero roared. "The gods envy me. I am God." But his words trembled, uncertain. Even he no longer believed them. By now, the servants had begun to flee. Some vanished into the night, others were caught and whipped for desertion. Yet for every voice silenced, a new whisper seemed to rise from the walls. The echoes grew stronger, closer. The musicians refused to play. The fountains gurgled like throats swallowing. One evening, as Nero wandered the colonnade alone, a breeze swept through the garden. The roses bent as if bowing, and the faint cry of an infant, impossibly distant, impossibly near, rose from the earth. The emperor froze. His goblet slipped from his hand, wine spilling across the marble like blood. "Who's there?" he demanded, but the garden only answered with wind. He ordered the soil dug up, every inch of it. When the slaves began to dig, they uncovered shards of fabric, bits of gold, and faint traces of ash. Nothing living, yet everything human. The emperor stared down at the dirt, breathing hard. "Cover it," he whispered finally. "Seal it forever." That night, he summoned artists to repaint the palace. "No more white," he said. "White remembers too much." The walls were blackened, the ceilings veiled in shadow, every image of the gods erased. He thought that darkness would silence the dead, but darkness only gave them voice. In the echoing corridors, footsteps followed him, though none were there. Lamps flickered without wind. Mirrors showed faces that should not exist. And as Nero stood before his reflection, pale, trembling, eyes hollow as the empire itself, he whispered to no one. Rome has begun to rot from the womb. The palace had gone silent. No laughter, no music, no footsteps echoed in its halls anymore. Nero lived surrounded by shadows and mirrors, each one reflecting his image, younger, cleaner, more divine than the man he had become. He had ordered them placed everywhere, believing reflection could conquer memory. Instead, it multiplied it. Every corner of the Domus Aurea whispered. The once golden walls, now painted black, glimmered faintly under the torchlight, like the inside of a tomb. The emperor walked these corridors alone, barefoot, his crown abandoned somewhere among the broken statues. Servants avoided his gaze, stepping aside as he passed. He spoke often now, not to people, but to the air. They were ungrateful, he would murmur. I gave them beauty. I gave them Rome. His voice trembled as if he feared what answered back. The palace records had been seized. Every mention of Claudia, of Poppaea, of the silent hands, erased. Nero commanded the scribes to destroy the ledgers, the birth records, the midwives' rosters. History must forget, he said. Only my reign remains. Scrolls were burned in the courtyard, their ashes rising like black snow over the gardens. Yet even as the pages turned to dust, the walls seemed to resist. The frescoes beneath the paint reappeared faintly in lamplight, outlines of women, of infants, of gods watching. No brush could bury them. Tigellinus brought him news of unrest outside the palace. Food riots, whispers of revolt, fires breaking out near the Circus Maximus. The people grow restless, Caesar, he said cautiously. They say Rome burns because the gods have turned their faces. Nero smiled faintly. Then let them watch it burn brighter. That night, flames leapt high over the city. From his balcony, Nero watched the horizon bleed red, the wind carrying the roar of collapsing roofs and screaming crowds. To him, it looked almost divine, a cleansing fire. Let the old die, he murmured. Let only beauty remain. But even the fire could not burn away his ghosts. In the smoke's reflection on the marble floor, Nero thought he saw figures moving, women draped in white, carrying infants of light and shadow. He stumbled back, clutching his robe. The air thickened with the scent of myrrh, of blood, of gardens after rain. Leave me, he cried. You were nothing. The torches flared and guttered. The mirrors along the hall quivered with faint shapes, 1,000 eyes staring back. He ran through the corridors, calling for guards who no longer answered. The palace had emptied itself of loyalty. He found himself before the sealed door to the garden. The soil there was dark, slick still. Moonlight fell in thin silver lines across it. For a long time, he stared at the ground, trembling. I made you all for greatness, he whispered. You were part of my perfection. But the garden stayed silent. By dawn, the emperor sat in his private chamber, surrounded by broken glass and fading torches. He had dismissed every servant. He ate nothing, spoke to no one. The empire outside smoldered. Inside, the silence had become absolute. When historians later described Nero's final days, they wrote of paranoia, of madness, of music played while Rome burned. But the truth was simpler, darker. His punishment was not the fire, it was the memory that refused to die. In the last hour before dawn, Nero gazed into a mirror clouded with soot. They said I was divine, he whispered, voice cracking. But gods do not bleed. Somewhere beneath the palace garden, the soil shifted, softly, as if breathing. And above it, the emperor lowered his head into silence.